The Quartet. Chapter 1. The Articles and the Vision. Certain I am that unless Congress speaks in a more decisive tone, unless they are vested with powers by the several states competent to the great purposes of war, that our cause is lost. I see one head gradually changing into 13. George Washington to Joseph Jones, May 31st, 1780. On March 1st, 1781, 3.5 years after they were endorsed by the Continental Congress, the Articles of Confederation were officially ratified when the last state, Maryland, gave its approval. The unseemly delay could be explained by the conspicuous fact that a war was going on, which inevitably deflected attention from all other business. But the specific reason was that the landless states, like Maryland, refused to ratify until all the states with extensive western claims, Virginia most prominently, agreed to cede their claims to Congress. The President of the Continental Congress, Samuel Huntington, declared the creation of a new political entity called the Confederation Congress, which established a perpetual union between the 13 United States. To mark the occasion, 13 cannons were fired on the hill overlooking the Philadelphia harbor, and that salvo was answered by 13 cannons from the frigate John Paul Jones. In the evening, a grand exhibition of fireworks was staged at the State House, and all the vessels in the harbor were decorated and illuminated. At almost the same time, the Americans were celebrating their newly declared union. A pamphleteer in London, Josiah Tucker, predicted that any vision of an emergent American nation state would prove to be a mirage, one of the idlest and most visionary notions that ever was conceived by the writers of romance. Tucker spoke for all those English and European pundits who regarded the very term United States as a comical oxymoron. The diversity of climates, competing regional interests, and long-standing political disagreements made it possible to imagine that Americans could ever, he put it, be united into one compact empire under any species of government whatsoever. What had brought them together in the summer of 1776 was their common desire to secede from that empire. If they failed in that effort, and the issue in the spring of 1781 remained uncertain, Americans would revert back to their identity as British subjects. If they were succeeded, they would dissolve into a political stew of local, state, and regional principalities likely to end up fighting one another. Their fate, predicted Tucker, seems to be a disunited people till the end of time. A closer look at the recently ratified document that was promoted all of those salvos and illuminations reveals that Tucker's skepticism about any emergent American nation state was not that far off the mark, for the Articles of Confederation were not, and were not intended to be, a political framework for a national government. Indeed, the Articles were not designed to establish any kind of government at all. As its name suggests, the Articles created a confederation of 13 sovereign states that were nations themselves, entering, and Article 3 put into a firm league of friendship with each other for their common defense, the security of their liberties, and their mutual and general welfare. It was less a constitution than a diplomatic treaty among sovereign powers. The key provision was Article 2. Each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence in every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this Confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. Those powers, jurisdictions, and rights were quite few, chiefly to resolve border disputes between states, establish standard weights and measures, and a common currency through the states were not prohibited from printing their own currency or money, and create a common treasury from funds raised by taxes on the states to pay for the war. Whether the states were legally obliged to pay the tax levies was left ambiguous. Article 8 vested authority in the state legislatures to comply within the time agreed upon by the United States and Congress assembled. For 3 years, the vast majority of states had failed to pay their share of taxes to support the Continental Army, leaving a legacy of confusion about where the power of the purse ultimately resided. In the absence of a clear resolution in the Articles, it effectively resided in the states. In at least two other aspects, it was clear that the political framework created by the Articles was not designed to function as a national government. First, the proper model for the Republican government had been established in the state constitutions, almost all of which followed the guidelines proposed by John Adams in his Thoughts on Government, 1776. The central ingredients in the Adams political recipe were a bicameral legislature, an elected or appointed governor, and an independent judiciary, an early version of the separation of powers doctrine, later embodied in the federal constitution. The structure of the Articles, a single House legislature, and an appointed but powerless president, dispensed with all the political wisdom that had accumulated in the states about a properly balanced Republican government, because in truth, that is not what the Articles were intended to be. Second, there was no way the Confederation Congress could claim to be a representative body. Article 5 put it in successively. In determining questions in the United States and Congress assembled, each state shall have one vote. This meant, in effect, that Rhode Island, the smallest state, had the same political power as Virginia. The one state, one vote principle represented a continuation of the practice followed in the Continental Congress, which had come into existence in 1774, before the debates over state constitutions occurred and before the commitment to proportional representation in the state legislature had become an accepted, indeed essential, constitutional feature. By rejecting proportional representation, the architects of the Articles were making a clear statement that they did not intend the Confederation Congress to function as a national government once the war was won. The closest approximation in our time is the European Union. It was not always so. During the first 15 months of the war, from the outbreak of hostilities at Lexington and Concord in April 1775 to the Declaration of Independence in July 1776, the Continental Congress had functioned as a provisional national government, exercising control over military strategy, diplomacy, and economic policy, much in the manner of a fully empowered federal government. To be sure, these were heady times when the all-consuming character of the political and military crisis literally forced the delegates at Congress to assume emergency powers, and to do so in a political environment so saturated with patriotism that dissent was tantamount to treason. In this exuberant moment, when all political disagreements were enveloped within the protective canopy of the cause, it became possible to believe that The wartime alliance was symptomatic of something much larger and more permanent. The Philadelphia physician and revolutionary gadfly Benjamin Rush had said it out loud: "We are now a new nation, dependent on each other, not totally independent states." The war for American independence had also become, at least in some minds, a war for American nationhood. But Rush's national vision proved to be a temporary infatuation until independence was officially declared on July 2nd, 1776, then announced to the world 2 days later. There was an enormous pressure to sustain a united front. The cracks and fissures in that front appear for all to see in late July and early August, when the delegates put themselves in a committee of what the whole format to debate the character and shape of the new government for the recently created United States. That debate proved to be a preview of coming attractions, exposing the latent sectional and ideological differences that would haunt the American experiment well into the next century. The debate focused on a document written by a committee of 12 delegates in June, prior to the vote on independence, and chaired by John Dickinson, the leader of the moderate faction in Congress, called the Dickinson Draft. It is a elusive text that has caused several generations of historians to throw up their hands in frustration because Dickinson attempted to synthesize the competing convictions of a large committee that harbored fundamentally different ideas about what the emergent American republic should look like. The Dickinson Draft is, in truth, one of the most revealing documents of the Revolutionary era, not in spite of, but because of, its intellectual incoherence. For what Dickinson attempted to achieve was a political compromise between those who wanted a state-based confederation and those who wanted a federal government with enumerated powers over the states. In other words, Dickinson tried and failed to do in the summer of 1776 what James Madison and his Federalist colleagues succeeded in doing in the summer of 1787. No official record of the debate exists between them was kept. Fortunately, both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson kept extensive notes on the deliberations, which occurred between July 22nd and August 20th. This meant that they coincided with the looming British invasion of Long Island. Despite that distraction, the political issues at stake got the attention of most prominent delegates, including John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. Ironically, Dickinson himself was absent, having gone to command his militia unit in New Jersey in anticipation of a British attack in New York. The debate exposed three fundamental disagreements. First, a sectional split between northern and southern states over slavery. Second, a division between large and small states over representation. And third, a more general argument between proponents for a confederation of sovereign states and advocates for a more consolidated national union. There was considerable overlap between the second and third arguments, since defenders of one state, one vote principle were implicitly rejecting the viability of a nation-sized republic. Slavery was too volatile a subject to be addressed directly. Indeed, there was an unspoken policy of silence surrounding the topic based on the broadly shared sense that it, more than any other issue, possessed the potential to destroy the political consensus that had formed around independence. But slavery was too embedded in the economy of the southern states to avoid altogether, and it came up, albeit obliquely, during debate over Article 12 of the Dickinson Draft, which proposed that the expenses for the war and the general welfare shall be defrayed out of the common treasury, which shall be supplied by the several colonies in proportion to the number of inhabitants of every age, sex, and quality, except Indians. An argument then ensued over how to count inhabitants, which soon became an argument over slaves, whether they persons or property. The delegates from the southern states insisted that slaves were property like horses and sheep, and therefore should not be counted as inhabitants. Franklin countered his claim with an edgy joke, observing that slaves, the last time he looked, did not behave like sheep. Sheep will never make any insurrections. The South Carolina delegation, which did not find this funny, then issued the ultimate threat. If the northern states insist on this point, there is an end of the Confederation. In response to this threat, the Southern secessionist movement, Samuel Chase of Maryland urged all delegates to calm down, then proposed to insert white before inhabitants in order to appease his Southern brethren. But the Northern delegates, led by Adams, objected strenuously to this change, accusing South Carolina of attempting to avoid its fair share of tax burden to finance the war. In a thoroughly sectional vote, Chase's amendments was defeated. In the long view, which is to say, looking down the road another 8 decades or so, this debate proved prophetic. It was the first occasion when the intractable dilemma posed by slavery found its way into public record, and in 1861, South Carolina acted on the same secessionist threat it first made in the summer of 1776. More immediately, both Northern and Southern delegates recognized the need to deflect the inhabitants question, and they revised the Dickinson drafts so that each state would be billed in proportion to the value of all land within each state, thereby skirting the slavery question, but in the process producing a criterion for taxation that proved inherently immeasurable and infinitely manipulatable by the state legislatures. If the debate over slavery had enormous long-term implications, the debate over representation posed more pressing problems than defined the shape of the political settlement for the next decade. Here, the argument was not sectional, but rather between large and small states. Article 18 of the Dickinson draft proposed a continuation of the one vote per state principle. Delegates from Massachusetts, Virginia, and Pennsylvania found that principle preposterous, indeed a recipe for chaos and endless bickering, because the disproportionate political power of the small states defied the economic realities. Let the small colonies give equal money and men, Franklin argued, momentarily forgetting that the colonies were now states, and then have an equal vote. Adams chimed in that the only sensible basis for representation was population, because any stable Republican government needed to reflect the will of its citizenry. Both Franklin and Adams were thinking of a new governor that was more potent and unified than a mere confederation. The most ardent advocate for such a vision was Rush, who projected a national picture of Americans as a single people, no longer Virginians or Rhode Islanders, and the term United States as a singular rather than plural noun. The debate over representation had thus exposed the first serious split between nationalists and confederationalists. Delegates from the small states found Rush's national vision a political nightmare that merely exchanged the despotic power of Parliament for a domestic version of the same Leviathan. Roger Sherman of Connecticut led the small state delegation with a warning that his constituents would never surrender their liberties to some distant government that did not share their values. He could testify that Connecticut would passionately embrace the cause, but once the war was won, his country was Connecticut, and any loyalty that extended beyond the borders of his state defied local and the most regional orientation of his constituents, which was as far as we are prepared to go. This was a revealing way to put it. Beneath the argument between large and small states over representation lurked a more fundamental disagreement about distance and scale. The vast majority of Americans lived and died locally. Representative government, as they experienced it, was a face-to-face affair. So that above and beyond, or rather beneath and beyond, questions of political architecture lay a residual psychological reality that was severely circumscribed and that imposed geographic limits on the political imaginations of the vast bulk of ordinary Americans. Feeding into the small-scale perspective were all the political arguments that colonists had thrown at the British ministry from 1765 to 1775, stigmatizing parliamentary power as illegitimate because it was distant and disconnected from their local and state interests. The greater the distance, in effect, the greater the distrust. The geographic boundaries of a state, as Sherman had so nicely put it, were as far as they were prepared to go. A decade later, this apprehension about governments beyond immediate surveillance became the primal source of anti-federalist opposition to the Constitution, and it was unquestionably the perspective of most American citizens. Almost as almost as an appendix to the debate between nationalists and confederationists was the debate over the ill-defined western borders of states like Virginia, which claims that reach to the Mississippi or even more preposterously to the Pacific. There was a consensus in Congress that these extravagant claims were based on colonial charters that had been drafted before anyone realized the size of the North American continent. One map put the Alleghenies within 100 miles of the Pacific. Administration to the Articles of Confederation required a state to cede its territorial claims to western lands, but left ambiguous how that cession would occur and whether the state could determine its own borders. This alienated the landless states, which worried that large states like Virginia and Pennsylvania and New York would become even larger upon arrival. In an effort to assure his colleagues from Maryland that the Old Dominion would behave responsibly, Thomas Jefferson insisted that no Virginian intended to go to the South Seas, an apparent reference to the Pacific, but only Virginians found this assurance convincing, knowing as we do that these huge political and constitutional questions over sovereignty, slavery, and the size of would define the history of the emerging American Republic well into the next century. The belief that these problems could be solved in a few weeks of earnest effort during the summer of 1776 seems unrealistic in the extreme. Looking back from the edge of the grave over 40 years later, Adams recalled that it was a standing miracle that the delegates could agree on anything. The colonies had grown up under conditions so different. There was so great a variety of religions. There was composed of so many different nations. There were customs, manners, habits, had so little resemblance, and their intercourse had been so rare, and their knowledge of each other so imperfect, that to unite them in the same principles and theory and the same systems of action was certainly a difficult enterprise. That was a quote from Adams. But that was not how he felt in the crucible of the moment. Adams was especially distraught to discover that the near unanimous consensus on American independence was followed by almost total disagreement over how an independent American republic should be configured. Thus, we are sowing the seeds of ignorance, corruption, and injustice, he lamented. In the fairest field of liberty ever appeared on earth, even in the first attempts to cultivate it, it was distressing to realize that beyond independence there was no consensus on what being an American meant, or whether there was such a thing at all. For Adams, it was especially distressing to witness such conspicuous failure. In the first formation of government erected by the people themselves on their own authority, without the poisonous interposition of kings and priests, there was to be such a thing as the cause, but the glorious potency of that concept did not translate to the people of the United States. Good Lord, this is a long deal here. I mean, I got to chapter 2. I got, crapola. What page am I on? 12. I gotta get to 28 for chapter 2. Oh, hey, Batman, you still there? I just now saw you. My bad. Hello. A little bit late. All right, page 12. That's not right. That's right. There we go. Okay. The debate over the Dickinson draft was simultaneously revealing and inconclusive. The former because it exposed the severe limits that would be imposed on any robust expression of federal power. The latter because final resolutions on all the controversial questions had to be deferred. The delegates in the Continental Congress could not afford to sustain focus on the unresolved political issues because in late August and early September, the Continental Army suffered a series of devastating defeats on Long Island and Manhattan that put its very survival at risk. It made no sense to debate the future shape of the American government if the Continental Army was annihilated, rendering any independent American future highly problematic. Over the course of the next year, from the fall of 1776 to the fall of 1777, the primary focus of the Continental Congress, again for understandable reasons, remained the war, with the exception of George Washington's splendid victories at Trenton and Princeton. General William Howe and the British Army dominated battlefield, producing victories at Brandywine and Germantown that led to the capture and occupation of Philadelphia, which prompted the flight of the Continental Congress, as Adams put it, like a covey of pigeons to York, Pennsylvania. Revisions of the Dickinson draft had to take a backseat to the pressuring imperative of sustaining the Continental Army and not losing the war. But despite those rather essential distractions, revisions of the Dickinson draft proceeded apace, and all the revisions reduced the prospective power of any central government. Article 19 of the Dickinson draft, for example, had contained language that might be interpreted to give the Confederate Congress authority over foreign policy. It was dropped. The Dickinson draft gave the Congress ultimate authority in resolving questions about western borders. This was blurred, and the inherent ambiguity of the Dickinson draft on the question of state versus federal sovereignty was clarified in an amendment by Thomas Burke of South Carolina. Each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this Confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. The final draft of the Articles of the Confederation that was sent to the states in November 1777 then had been cleansed from any language that visioned the existence of an American nation state after the war. To be sure, the Dickinson draft had always been a tortured document that leaned toward a state-based confederation, and it was always clear that the vast majority of Americans did not regard the war for independence as a movement for American nationhood, to the extent they gave the matter any thought at all. The final draft of the Articles of Confederation then merely confirmed and institutionalized that conviction. When the articles were sent to the states, the letter accompanying the document urged ratification more as a wartime measure than as any commitment to a future American Union. Failure to ratify, the letter warned, would send a signal of weakness to the British government, which would then redouble its military effort, thereby forcing America to bid adieu to independence, to liberty, to safety. Even the states that swiftly ratified submitted amendments, nearly 100, most designed to protect local and state interests from federal encroachment. The Congress simply ignored them, but they constituted another sign that whatever pretensions for a national union might have existed in the early months of the war had wholly evaporated as the conflict drew to a close. Then there was the matter of the Army, along with the Continental Congress, the other institutional projection of collective commitment with national implications. As the war dragged on, the same centrifugal force that moved political power from the Congress to the states also undermined popular support for the Continental Army. Over 200 years later, when paintings, films, and histories remind us of the deplorable conditions endured by ordinary men to win American independence, and most of the images and words are utterly accurate, it is difficult to recover the combination of abuse and neglect directed at the Continental Army by most of the American citizenry at the time. There are two enormous and overlapping ironies at work here, which taken together represent a central paradox of the American Revolution. Namely, the two institutions that made victory in the war for independence possible, the Continental Congress and the Continental Army, represented a consolidated kind of political and military power that defied the Republican principles on which the American Revolution was purportedly founded. If we wish to push this line of argument to its logical limit, we would say that the ideological and emotional hostility to a conspicuous and centralized expression of political authority rendered the viable American nations inherently incompatible with the goals of the American Revolution. The military side of this story had its origins in the fall of 1776. The American debacle on Long Island and Manhattan prompted a conference among Washington, his staff, and the delegation from the Congress. It was now clear for all to see the Continental Army, as currently configured, was no match for the combined forces of the British Army and Navy. Washington insisted that the civilian delegates agreed that there needed to be a new establishment consisting of an American army 3 times larger than the current 15,000-man force, with enlistments to last 3 years or better yet for the duration. Given the overall size of the American population, Washington argued that he was asking for only a fraction of what was demographically possible, meaning that the number of American males available for military service was several times larger than what was needed to overwhelm the British Army if provided with such a large, enduring, dedicated force Washington and his staff believed they could end the war in a year. In October 1776, Congress approved all the requests, but when President John Hancock sent the troop quotas to the respective state legislatures, they were regarded as requests and none of them states complied. What was militarily necessary was clear, but what was politically impossible was clearer. The states, after all, needed to protect their own people, best done with militia, often paid at a higher rate than soldiers in the Continental Army. As for the creation of the charade of Continentals committed to service for their duration, that smelled distinctly like a standing army in the British mode, which the American Revolution was designed to destroy. The hard core of the Continental Army was eventually compromised of misfits, comprised, comprised of misfits, indentured servants, recently arrived immigrants, emancipated slaves, unemployed artisans. The vast majority of the soldiery, as Washington called them, were 1 year enlistees who had came and went like transients, an army of amateurs. Washington's reports from the field became a litany of lamentations bemoaning the lack of food, clothing, shoes, ammunitions, warning that the 1 year enlistments put the very survival of the army at risk on an annual basis, urging the necessity of a large army of veteran troops who could assume the offensive instead of fighting a purely defensive war. But the unspoken, unattractive truth was that the marginal status of the Continental Army was reassuring. Was reassuring for the vast majority. Hello. For the vast majority of Americans, since a robust and professional army of the British model contradicted the very values it was supposedly fighting for. It had to be just strong enough to win the war, or perhaps more accurately, not lose it, but not so strong as to threaten the Republican goals the war was ultimately about. Beginning in 1780, Washington went on the offensive, claiming that the lack of support for the Continental Army was a direct consequence of the failure of the Continental Congress to impose its will on the states. Certain I am, he warned, that unless Congress speaks in a more decisive tone, unless they are vested with powers by several states competent to the great purpose of war, that our cause is lost. I see one head gradually changing into 13. Over and over he repeated the refrain that a confederation of sovereign states, almost by definition, lacked the unity of purpose necessary to win the war. In a word, our measures are not under the influence and direction of one council, but 13, each of which is actuated by local views and politics. As a result, we have become a many-headed monster, a heterogeneous mass that never will nor can steer to the same point. Though his own personal honor was obviously invested in the eventual triumph of American independence, he wanted it placed in the record that if we fail for want of proper exertions in any state governments, I trust the responsibility will fall where it ought, and that I shall stand justified to the Congress, to my country, and to the world. If a potent Congress and a powerful army were in fact incompatible with the principles of which the American Revolution was based, then everyone needed to realize that the war could not be won, and that all principles would prove meaningless. Despite his own personal preference for political unity vested in Continental Congress in 1777, Washington started writing a series of circular letters to the states. It had become obvious that the power of the purse now resided in the state governments, and if he wanted to lobby for longer enlistments and money to give his troops shirts and shoes, the governors and legislatures of the states were the proper place to direct his attention. Doing so was itself a statement about the increasingly diffused political realities that protracted conflict and created. The survival of the Continental Army was now dependent on persuading 13 provinces, each of them divided into multiple counties and towns, to act together. If there was any doubt in Washington's mind whether the center was going to hold, and there was no doubt in anyone's mind about who was the one-man centerpiece of the American Revolution. Even before independence was declared, Washington had become the chief symbol of resistance to British rule. It helped that he looked the part. Biographers do not agree about his height, but all concur he was a full head taller than the average male of his time, a physical specimen at just over 200 pounds, who was also reputed to be a finest horseman in Virginia. In his youth, he had earned fame during the French and Indian War for surviving the massacre at the Monongahela in 1755, when the British Army under General Edward Braddock was ambushed outside modern-day Pittsburgh, and Washington lived to tell the tale. Despite bullet holes in his coat and hat, and 2 horses shot out from under him. He then parlayed his military reputation into marriage with Martha Custis, the wealthiest widow in Virginia, which propelled him into the upper ranks of the Tidewater aristocracy. He was a literate but not well-read man. Adams had gone to Harvard, Jefferson to William and Mary, but Washington had gone to war, meaning his education possessed a more primal quality that aligned himself nicely with his commanding physical presence. Was not well versed in the constitutional arguments about Parliament's limited authority over the American colonies, often deferring to his neighbor George Mason on such questions. His own encounter with British imperialism had been more personal and palatable based on his experience with the London Mercantile House, Carey and Company, which he believed was bleeding him to death by charging extravagant fees for its services. For Washington, the imperious base of the British Empire was not Parliament, but Robert Carey and his band of London merchants, whose profits were driving the entire planter class of Virginia into bankruptcy. Washington's towering ego could not stand the realization his very fate was in the hands of British creditors and Ocean Away, who were manipulating interest rates, or so he believed, in a massive imperial swindle. Oh, fuck, it hasn't changed. It sounds like that's the stuff they do nowadays with interest rates and shit. Okay, let's go on to the next chapter. Or the next verse, I mean. We're still in chapter 1. Not the kind of man to suffer fools gladly, he ran his plantation at Mount Vernon imperiously and assiduously, always on the lookout for laziness among his overseers. He was not someone you would want to work for. He had once applied for a commission in the British Army and been turned down. Imagine the course of American history if the British had accepted him. But he interpreted his rejection not as a measure of his worth, but as a statement of British stupidity. Both physically and psychologically, he was a formidable figure. And at 43 years, he was at the peak of his powers. When he set out from his beloved Mount Vernon in May of 1775 to attend the Continental Congress, he had no way of knowing that he would be appointed commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Or did he? Why else did he wear his military uniform, the only delegate to do so? What he did know, beyond much doubt was that the 10-year constitutional conflict with Great Britain was about to become a war. Indeed, it had already started a month earlier at Lexington and Concord. While a majority of delegates in the Continental Congress continued to grope for a political solution to his crisis, Washington knew in his bones that none would be found. He left instructions with his plantation manager to remove his books and his wife, Martha, presumably not in that order, when British frigates came up to the Potomac to burn Mount Vernon to the ground. Washington recognized from the start that he was risking everything he held dear by committing to American independence, and this over a year before Jefferson wrote the words that memorialized the patriotic pledge of our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And honor in a way that is difficult for modern minds to fully appreciate, animated his every thought and feeling. When he accepted the appointment as head of what soon would be called the Continental Army on June 16, 1775, he gave a speech making 2 points. He did not believe himself qualified for the position, and he would serve without pay. That evening he wrote his brother-in-law in the same vein. I am now embarked on a tempestuous ocean from whence perhaps no friendly harbor is to be found. It is an honor I wish to avoid. I can answer but for 3 things: a firm belief in the justice of our cause, close attention to the prosecution of it, and the strictest integrity. If these cannot supply the places of ability and experience, the cause will suffer, and more than probably my charter along with it, as reputation derives its principal support from success. He was a smart person. He demonstrated the same pattern of postured resistance on 2 subsequent occasions, when he agreed to chair the Constitutional Convention and when he accepted the office of president. The pattern suggests he had a problem in acknowledging his own ambitions, always insisting that the summons to serve originated outside his own soul, but this decision to head the American Army was especially poignant because he knew that the British Army and Navy, taken together, was the most formidable military power on the planet, and the prospects for American success were dubious at best. There was no question in his mind about the moral supremacy of the American cause, but he was at the core a rock-ribbed realist who realized that a fervent belief in the worthiness of a cause was no guarantee of its ultimate triumph. He was lashing his life, and even more psychologically important to him, his honor, to a vessel that was sailing into uncharted and troubled waters. From the beginning, then, the war for Washington was a lower nothing wager. Therefore, to be sure, enormous political consideration at stake, he announced from the start that he regarded the Continental Army as subservient to civilian control, as embodied in the Continental Congress. This was done without much pondering, almost breezily, a decision that becomes significant only when one realizes that Julius Caesar, Oliver Cromwell, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Simon Bolivar never managed to make it. There were also pressing strategic questions about how to conduct the war. It took him more than a year to gain control over his own aggressive instincts, which nearly proved a fatal liability in the New York campaign. Eventually, he realized that a defensive strategy, called a war of posts, was preferred course, even though it defied every fiber of his being. His seminal strategic insight, which seems obvious in retrospect, was that he did not need to win the war, The British needed to win. He would win by not losing, which in practice meant keeping the Continental Army intact and the institutional embodiment of American independence. After the debacle in New York, 1776, survival became his central mission. More important than besting the British Army on the battlefield, where he was often outmaneuvered. Indeed, no successful American general ever lost so many battles. I didn't know that. That's interesting. His greatest gift was resilience rather than brilliance, which just happened to be the quality of mind and heart the American cause required. All his energies and ambitions, both of which were bottomless, were fully invested in winning, or rather in not losing the war, so that his iconic demeanor became a kind of personal signature about the inevitability of the eventual outcome. Within the Confederation Congress, and the state legislators, then below them, the country and town governments, there was a veritable cacophony of voices about what American independence, once achieved, would mean. And the further down you went, the more democratically you dove, the more diverse and dissonant the voices became. The only subject on which all those voices could agree was that whatever the American Revolution meant, Washington epitomized it. He was, as the toast in his honor put it, the man who unites all hearts. Even though his commitment to civilian control of the military never wavered, Washington's defense to his civilian superiors did not deter him from lecturing them on the inadequacies of the Confederation created by the Articles. The vantage point from which he viewed the pathetic powers of the Congress was of course distinctive, since he was always asking it for financial support that it was inherently incapable of providing. The disappointing direction of the dialogue became so predictable that Washington came to regard the ongoing conversations as a running joke. The army, as usual, is without pay, and a great part of the soldiery without shirts, and if once was to hazard to them Congress an opinion, it would be the army had contracted such a habit of encountering distress and difficulties and of living without money that it would be impolitic and injurious to introduce other customs to it. But he began to use his circular letters as occasions to lecture its as well as joke. Even before the decisive victory at Yorktown, Washington was thinking about the post-war world, and his major concern was that the same structural problem that blocked support for the army, in effect, a confederation designed to be weak at the center, would have dire, indeed calamitous consequences after independence. As he put it in the letter to the President of Congress, I am decided in my opinion that if the powers of Congress are not enlarged and made competent to all general purposes, that the blood which has been spilt, the experience that has been incurred, and the distress that have been felt will avail in nothing, and that the band, already too weak, which holds us together, will soon be broken, when anarchy and confusion must prevail. There is no question that Washington wanted the newly independent United States to become a republic in which consensus rather than coercion was the central political value. But he wanted that republic to cohere as a union rather than as a confederation of sovereign states. In his capacity as a commander-in-chief, he could testify that the Confederation model nearly lost the war, and it persisted in its current form. He believed that it would lose the peace. In June 1783, he sat down to compose his last circular letter to the states. Though a man of action more than words, on this occasion He offered a truly panoramic assessment of why the just concluded War for Independence could also be called the American Revolution, and why the consolidation of its revolutionary energies required a national government capable of orchestrating those energies. It was the most profound political statement he ever wrote. In his visionary appraisal, the newly arrived American Republic was the beneficiary of two extraordinary pieces of good fortune. The first, a function of time, and the second of space. On the time side, the United States came into existence during an era when the rights of mankind were better understood and more clearly defined than at any former period. Immanuel Kant had yet to coin the term Enlightenment to describe his chapter in Western history, but even without the convenient vocabulary, Washington clearly grasped the central idea, namely that the American Revolution had happened as a truly providential moment. It occurred when a treasure trove of human knowledge about society and government had replaced the medieval assumptions, that gloomy age of ignorance and superstition, and thereby provided Americans with an unprecedented opportunity to construct a society according to political principles that maximized the prospects for personal freedom and happiness more fully than ever before. In effect, European thinkers over the past century had drafted the blueprint for a new political architecture, which was now readily available for Americans to implement. At this period, in, at this period, he intoned, the United States came into existence as a nation, and if their citizenry and citizens should not be completely free and happy, the fault will be inherently their own. The problem with this prophecy was that its uplifting implications depended on the existence of a nation state capable of enforcing a comprehensive version of political coherence. A confederation of sovereign states, the kind of league currently configured in the Articles, would not suffice. In that sense, Washington was implicitly arguing that the full potential of the American Revolution could be realized only if and when local, state, and regional alliances, which remained hegemonic, were subsumed within some larger purpose. Given the firmly lodged conviction, it was more a potent impulse than a mere idea, that any distant national government was, by definition, a hostile force. The potential of American nation remained a utopian dream that few took seriously. Washington was one of the few, and his expansive vision, which eventually came to be called Manifest Destiny, was continental in scale. The citizens of America, placed in the most inevitable conditions as the sole lords and proprietors of a vast tract of continent, comprehending all the various soils and climates of the world, and abounding with all the necessaries and conveniences of life, are now by the late satisfactory pacification acknowledged to be possessed of absolute freedom and independency. They are, in this period, to be considered as actors on a most conspicuous theater, which seems to be peculiarly designed by Providence for the display of human greatness and felicity. By the late pacification, he was referring to the recently arrived Treaty of Paris of 1783, officially ending the war and not so incidentally placing the western border of the United States at the Mississippi River. The Americans had not only won their independence from the British Empire, they had also acquired an empire of their own. No one quite knew what this enormous tract contained, apart from waves of impenetrable forests and clusters of virulently hostile Indian tribes who had not been informed that, with a scratch of a pen in Paris, they had just lost the land they had been living on for several centuries. As a young man, Washington had explored and surveyed the eastern rim of the interior region, and as a reward for his service in the French and Indian War, he had been given nearly 30,000 acres in what was called the Ohio Country, and like several other Virginians, including Thomas Jefferson, he was obsessed with the misguided idea that the Potomac provided the best access to the boundless riches on the far side of the Appalachian Range, meaning the towns of Alexandria was destined to become the greatest port in North America. More generally, over a century before Frederick Jackson Turner made Western expansion the central theme in American history, Washington had realized that the occupation and settlement of the not so vacant land to the west would define America's domestic agenda for generations to come. When he was asked if he wished to do a grand tour of European capitals, Paris, London, Rome, Vienna, he diplomatically declined, saying he preferred to visit Detroit, New Orleans, and the Floridas. Europe was the past, the American West was the future, and at least a Washington saw it. Those Western horizons fundamentally changed the chemistry of the political conversation by rendering the local and state perspectives of the current Confederation pathetically provincial. To be sure, he was on record as a staunch advocate for a fully empowered federal government throughout the war, and he firmly believed that the failure to create such a government had severely handicapped the war effort, protracting the conflict and suffering unnecessarily. And he made no secret of his conviction that the Articles were a recipe for anarchy in post war America, destined to dissolve his legacy of American independence into a confused constellation at best, regional sovereignties vulnerable to the predatory plans of hovering European powers. But now the almost inadvertent acquisition of Western empire created a collective interest that all the states shared. Throughout the war, the Union of States had been held together, however tentatively, by a common goal of independence. Once that goal was achieved, the state governments were poised to go their own separate ways, loosely confederated under the Articles. As Washington saw it, the West replaced the war as the common bond. How to manage this extraordinary asset was obviously the central question facing the next generation of American political leaders, and doing so required one to think nationally rather than locally. Washington was distinctive in his vision of a new nation held together by a covenant to distribute the proceeds of a common trust that, truth be told, contained the most fertile land and some of the most untapped natural resources on earth. He was predicting that the imperatives of geography, which were apparently limitless, would overwhelm the imperatives of ideology, which were narrowly confined. Though history eventually proved him right, very few American statesmen agreed with him at the time, and the vast majority of American farmers, lacking the vision, were indisposed to look past the wooden fences enclosing their fields. They were living in the moment, and the moment after the Revolution imposed severe restrictions on the exercise of centralized political power that bore any similarity to the imperial power of the British rulers they had just vanquished. The state-based political architecture of the Articles accurately expressed the constricted convictions of that moment. Washington's vision was not about the moment, but about the future. The great challenge was how to get there, for that would require replacing a political structure that was unequal to the task, a seismic step beyond the imagination of most Americans. Oh my goodness, it took me an hour to read that chapter. All right, That's chapter 1. We'll come back some other time for chapter 2. Thank you for joining.